She pushed her mother-in-law out at midnight because she was smelling. What the husband did next will shock you. Hello everyone, welcome to our story. Please don't forget to like and share and tell us in the comments where you are reading from. On a cold Tuesday night in November, David was driving home from his business trip. He had been away for 7 long days and he missed his family. The clock on his car showed 11:45 at night. The streets were empty and quiet. David smiled as he thought about surprising his wife Sarah and his mother Margaret. He wasn't supposed to come home until Sunday, but his meetings finished early. They will be so happy to see me, he thought. As David turned into his street, he could see his house at the end. It was a nice house with a small garden that his mother loved to take care of. But something looked strange tonight. David slowed down his car. He squinted his eyes to see better in the moonlight. There was someone sitting outside his front door. A small figure hunched over on what looked like a stool. That's weird, David said to himself. Who would be sitting outside this late at night? David parked his car and got out. As he walked closer to his house, his heart started beating faster. The person outside was an old woman wearing thin clothes. She was shivering in the cold night air. Mom? David called out, not believing what he was seeing. The old woman lifted her head slowly. It was Margaret, his mother. Her face was pale, her lips were blue from the cold, and her gray hair was messy. When she saw David, her eyes filled with tears. David? Margaret whispered. Her voice was shaky and weak. You came home early. David ran to his mother and knelt down in front of her. He took her ice-cold hands in his. Mom, what are you doing outside? It's freezing. Where is Sarah? Why aren't you inside the house? Margaret looked down at the ground. She seemed embarrassed and didn't want to look at David. A tear rolled down her wrinkled cheek. Your wife said I was smelling, Margaret whispered so quietly that David had to lean closer to hear her. She told me to sit outside until morning to get fresh air. David felt like the world stopped spinning. His mouth dropped open and his eyes grew wide with shock. She made you sit outside? All night? In this cold? David's voice was getting louder, but he tried to stay calm for his mother. Margaret nodded slowly. She locked the door after I came out. I knocked gently but she didn't answer. I didn't want to wake the neighbors. David looked at his mother's thin nightgown and bare feet in wet slippers. He touched her hands, they felt like ice. His heart broke seeing the woman who raised him sitting outside like this. But David didn't know this was just the beginning. What he would discover next about his wife Sarah would change everything forever. David looked at his watch. It was now past midnight. His mother had been sitting outside in the freezing cold for more than 3 hours. He could see her breath making small white clouds when she spoke. How long have you been out here, Mom? David asked gently, still holding her cold hands. Since about 9 o'clock, Margaret answered quietly. I was watching my evening television show when Sarah came home. She seemed angry about something. She walked into the living room and said the house smelled terrible because of me. David felt his anger growing, but he tried to stay calm. What happened next? Margaret's voice became even quieter. She told me to go outside for fresh air. When I asked when I could come back in, she said maybe in the morning when the smell was gone. David couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was his mother, the same woman who had worked 2 jobs to send him to school. The same woman who went hungry so he could eat. And his wife had treated her like garbage. Mom, let's get you inside right now, David said firmly. He helped Margaret stand up from the stool. Her legs were stiff from sitting in the cold for so long. David put his arm around his mother's shoulders and walked with her to the front door. The porch light was off, making everything look dark and unwelcoming. David knocked on the door loudly. Sarah, he called out. Open this door right now. For a moment there was silence. Then they heard slow footsteps inside the house. The footsteps sounded like someone who didn't want to come to the door. Finally they heard the locks being turned. The door opened slowly. Sarah appeared in the doorway wearing a beautiful silk nightgown. Her hair was perfect and she looked warm and comfortable. When she saw David, her face showed complete surprise. David. Sarah gasped. What are you doing here? You weren't supposed to come back until Sunday. David stared at his wife. She looked so comfortable and warm while his mother had been freezing outside. This made him even more angry. Why is my mother sitting outside in the cold? David asked. His voice was quiet, but there was something dangerous in the way he spoke. Sarah's eyes moved quickly between David and Margaret. She seemed to be thinking of what to say. After a few seconds, she put on a fake smile. Oh, Margaret wanted some fresh air, Sarah said, trying to sound casual. You know how she likes to sit outside sometimes. She said the house felt stuffy. David felt his heart pounding with anger. He looked at his mother, who was still shivering next to him. "Mom, is that true?" David asked gently. Margaret looked at Sarah with fear in her eyes. Then she looked at David. She seemed scared to speak the truth, but finally she shook her head slowly. "No, son," Margaret whispered. "Sarah told me I was smelling up the house. She said I needed to go outside and stay there until morning." Sarah's face turned red when she heard this. She knew she had been caught in a lie. "That's not exactly what happened," Sarah said quickly, her voice getting higher. "I just thought some fresh air would be good for her. Old people need fresh air, right?" David stared at his wife with disbelief. Even now, even when she was caught lying, Sarah was still trying to make excuses. "We're going inside," David said firmly. "All of us." He helped his mother walk past Sarah into the warm house. Sarah stepped aside, but David could see the angry look on her face. Inside the house, David noticed something else that made him even more upset. The living room was perfectly clean and smelled like expensive perfume. There was no bad smell anywhere. Sarah had lied about everything. David sat his mother down on the couch and covered her with a soft blanket. He could see that she was slowly stopping her shivering as the warm air touched her skin. "I'll make you some hot tea, Mom," David said softly. As David walked to the kitchen, Sarah followed him. She grabbed his arm and whispered angrily, "Why are you making such a big deal about this? She's fine, isn't she?" David stopped walking and turned to look at his wife. For the first time in their marriage, he saw Sarah for who she really was. And what he saw made him sick to his stomach. But this was only the beginning of what would be the longest night of David's life. David pulled his arm away from Sarah's grip. He stared at her with eyes that she had never seen before. They were cold and angry. "She's fine?" David repeated Sarah's words slowly. "My mother was sitting outside in freezing cold for 3 hours, and you think she's fine?" Sarah rolled her eyes. "David, you're being dramatic. It's not that cold outside. And honestly, I couldn't breathe in this house anymore." "What do you mean you couldn't breathe?" David asked. Sarah crossed her arms and looked annoyed. "Your mother uses those smelly herbal creams on her joints. And she cooks with those strong spices that make the whole house stink. I had friends coming over tomorrow, and I didn't want them to smell that old person smell." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. His wife was talking about his mother like she was garbage, not a human being. "Those herbal creams help her arthritis pain," David said, his voice getting louder. "And those spices are from recipes her own mother taught her. They're part of our family tradition." "Well, I don't care about your family traditions," Sarah snapped back. "This is my house too, and I shouldn't have to live like this." David felt like Sarah had slapped him across the face. "Your house. This house exists because my mother sold her land to pay for my education. The money I make to pay for this house comes from the education she gave me." Sarah looked surprised. David had never spoken to her like this before. Usually he was quiet and tried to keep peace between his wife and his mother. "David, you're scaring me," Sarah said, trying to make her voice sound sweet. "Why are you so angry? I was just trying to help. Fresh air is good for old people." But David was not fooled by her fake sweet voice anymore. "Help? You locked my mother outside in the cold. That's not help, Sarah. That's cruelty." From the living room they heard a small cough. David remembered his mother was still sitting on the couch, probably listening to everything they were saying. David walked back to the living room, leaving Sarah standing alone in the kitchen. He sat down next to his mother and took her hands again. "Mom, I'm so sorry this happened to you," David said softly. "Tell me the truth. Has Sarah done things like this before when I was away?" Margaret looked toward the kitchen to make sure Sarah wasn't listening. Then she looked back at David with sad eyes. "Son, I don't want to cause problems in your marriage," Margaret whispered. "Mom, please. I need to know the truth," David said gently. Margaret took a deep breath. "This week while you were gone, things were different. Sarah stopped letting me eat meals with her. She would give me a plate of leftover food and tell me to eat in my room." David's heart was breaking as he listened. "She also told me I couldn't watch television in the living room because I made the couch smell old," Margaret continued. "And yesterday she had some friends over. When one of them asked who I was, Sarah said I was just the housekeeper." David felt his hands start to shake with anger. "She told people you were the housekeeper?" Margaret nodded sadly. "When her friends left, she told me that I embarrassed her by walking through the living room. She said next time her friends come over, I should stay hidden in my room." David stood up from the couch. His face was red with anger and his hands were in tight fists. He had heard enough. Sarah walked back into the living room with a glass of water in her hand. She still had that fake smile on her face. I brought some water for Margaret, Sarah said, trying to sound caring. But David was done with Sarah's fake kindness. What he was about to do next would shock everyone, including Sarah herself. David looked at the glass of water in Sarah's hand, then looked at her face. He could see that she was still pretending to be the caring wife, but now he knew the truth. Keep your water, David said in a cold voice. My mother doesn't need anything from you. Sarah's fake smile disappeared. Excuse me? What's that supposed to mean? David walked closer to Sarah until he was standing right in front of her. He was not a tall man, but right now he looked very scary. It means I know who you really are now, David said slowly. You're not the woman I married. You're not the woman I thought you were. Sarah laughed, but it was not a happy laugh. It was a mean laugh. Oh please, David. You're being so dramatic over nothing. Your mother is fine. Look at her, she's sitting on the couch, she's warm now. What's the big problem? The big problem, David said, his voice getting louder, is that you treated my mother like trash. You made her eat alone in her room like she was some kind of animal. You told your friends she was the housekeeper. You locked her outside in the cold because you didn't like how she smelled. Sarah rolled her eyes again. David, you don't understand what it's like living with an old person every day. The smells, the weird habits, the way she shuffles around the house. It's disgusting. Margaret heard this from the couch and started to cry quietly. She put her hand over her mouth to try to hide her sobs. When David saw his mother crying, something inside him broke completely. Disgusting? David repeated, his voice now shaking with anger. You think my mother is disgusting? Yes. Sarah shouted, not caring anymore about pretending to be nice. I said what I said. Living with old people is gross, and I'm tired of pretending it's not. David stared at his wife like he was seeing her for the first time. This woman, who he had loved and married, was showing him her true heart. And her heart was cold and cruel. Do you know what's really disgusting, Sarah? David asked quietly. What? Sarah snapped back. Your heart, David said. Your ugly, selfish heart. Sarah's mouth dropped open. David had never talked to her like this before. How dare you speak to me like that? Sarah yelled. I'm your wife. You're supposed to be on my side, not hers. David looked back at his mother, who was still crying on the couch. Then he looked at Sarah, who was standing there with an angry face, caring only about herself. You want to know whose side I'm on? David asked. I'm on the side of the woman who worked 3 jobs so I could go to school. I'm on the side of the woman who sold everything she owned so I could go to university. I'm on the side of the woman who went hungry so I could eat. Sarah's face was getting redder with anger. That's ancient history. What about what I've done for you? What about our marriage? What about me? David looked around the beautiful house. He looked at the nice furniture and the expensive decorations. Then he thought about his mother sitting outside in the cold while Sarah enjoyed all of this comfort. You know what, Sarah? David said in a very calm voice. You're right. This is your house too. Sarah smiled, thinking David was finally agreeing with her. But you know what else? David continued. If you can't respect my mother in this house, then you can't stay in this house. Sarah's smile disappeared immediately. What are you saying? David walked to the closet and pulled out a big suitcase. He set it down on the floor with a loud thud. I'm saying pack your bags, David said. Right now. Sarah started laughing, but it was a nervous laugh. You're joking, right? You can't be serious. David looked at his wife with cold eyes. Do I look like I'm joking? For the first time that night, Sarah realized that David was not playing games. But what happened next would surprise everyone even more. Sarah stared at the suitcase on the floor, then looked back at David's serious face. She couldn't believe this was really happening. David, you can't be serious, Sarah said, her voice starting to shake. You're going to kick me out of my own house because of your old mother? This house belongs to my family, David said firmly. My mother helped pay for it with her sacrifice. And anyone who can't respect her doesn't belong here. Sarah's eyes filled with angry tears. Fine. You want me to apologize to her? I'll apologize. Margaret, I'm sorry, okay? They're happy now? But David shook his head. It's too late for fake apologies, Sarah. You showed me who you really are tonight. Margaret stood up slowly from the couch. Her legs were still shaky from sitting in the cold for so long. David, please don't fight because of me. Maybe I should go stay somewhere else. No, Mom. David said quickly. You're not going anywhere. This is your home. You belong here. Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. So I have to leave, but she gets to stay? That's not fair. Fair? David repeated. Was it fair when you made my mother sit outside in freezing cold? Was it fair when you made her eat alone in her room like a prisoner? Was it fair when you told people she was just the housekeeper? Sarah realized that David knew everything. All her secrets were out in the open now. Look, I made some mistakes, Sarah said, trying to sound sorry. But we can fix this. We can make rules. She can stay in her room more and I'll try to be nicer. We don't have to end our marriage over this. David looked at Sarah like she was a stranger. Rules? You want to make rules about how my mother can live in her own home? Well, yes, Sarah said. If we're all going to live together, there have to be boundaries. David picked up the suitcase and threw it on the couch next to where his mother had been sitting. The only boundary I'm making tonight is this, David said. You need to pack your things and leave. Right now. Sarah's mouth dropped open. She looked around the beautiful living room with all her expensive decorations and furniture. You can't just throw me out in the middle of the night. Sarah protested. Where am I supposed to go? You can go to your parents' house, David said. I'm sure they'll take you in. Sarah started crying, but these were angry tears, not sad tears. My parents are going to ask me why I'm there. What am I supposed to tell them? Tell them the truth, David said coldly. Tell them you threw an old woman out in the cold because you didn't like how she smelled. Sarah's face turned white. She knew her parents would be very angry if they heard what she had done. Her mother had always taught her to respect older people. David, please, Sarah begged. Let's talk about this tomorrow when we're both calmer. Don't make me leave tonight. But David was done listening to Sarah's excuses and begging. You had no problem making my mother stay outside all night, David said. Now you can see how it feels. David walked to the stairs and started going up to their bedroom. I'm going to get more of your clothes. Start packing that suitcase. Sarah stood in the living room staring at the suitcase. She couldn't believe this was really happening. But when she heard David's footsteps upstairs, opening drawers and closets, she realized he was serious. Margaret walked over to Sarah with slow, careful steps. Sarah thought maybe the old woman was going to help her or say something kind. Instead, Margaret looked Sarah in the eyes and said something that would stay with Sarah forever. I never asked for much, Margaret said quietly. Her voice was soft but strong. I just wanted to live peacefully in my son's house. I wanted to help cook dinner sometimes. I wanted to watch television with my family. I wanted to feel like I belonged somewhere. Sarah looked down at the floor, not wanting to meet Margaret's eyes. I raised David by myself after his father died, Margaret continued. I worked at the grocery store during the day and cleaned offices at night. My hands got so sore from scrubbing floors, but I never complained. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, but Margaret kept talking. When David got sick with pneumonia when he was 12, I sold my wedding ring to pay for his medicine. When he wanted to play soccer with his friends, I bought him shoes even though I had holes in mine. Margaret's voice was getting stronger now. I sold the land that my husband left me, the only valuable thing I owned, so David could go to university. I believed education was more important than money. Sarah finally looked up at Margaret. For the first time, she was seeing her not as an annoying old woman, but as a person with feelings and a history. All I ever wanted, Margaret said, was for my son to be happy. When he told me he wanted to marry you, I was happy for him. Even when I saw how you looked at me like I was dirt under your shoe, I stayed quiet because David loved you. Sarah's eyes started to fill with tears, but they weren't angry tears anymore. They were tears of shame. But tonight, you crossed a line that can never be uncrossed, Margaret said. You showed my son exactly what kind of person you are. And now you have to live with the consequences. Just then, David came back downstairs carrying 2 more suitcases full of Sarah's clothes. He set them down next to the first one. That's everything from upstairs, David said. Your jewelry, your makeup, your shoes, it's all packed. Sarah looked at the 3 suitcases sitting on the floor. Her whole life in this house was now packed into 3 bags. David, this is crazy, Sarah said, her voice breaking. We've been married for 2 years. You're going to throw that all away for one mistake. David stared at his wife. One mistake. Sarah, you've been cruel to my mother for months. Tonight was just the night I finally saw it with my own eyes. But I can change. Sarah cried. I promise I can be better. I'll be nice to your mother, I'll respect her. Just give me another chance. David shook his head slowly. I can't trust you anymore, Sarah. If you could treat my mother like this, what else are you capable of? Sarah realized that no amount of begging or promising was going to change David's mind. She wiped the tears from her eyes and tried to look strong. Fine, Sarah said, lifting her chin up. If that's how you want it, then fine. But don't come crying to me when you realize what you've lost. David picked up 2 of the suitcases and walked toward the front door. I already know what I almost lost, he said. I almost lost my mother's trust and love because I chose the wrong woman. Sarah grabbed the 3rd suitcase and followed David to the door. As they reached the front entrance, she turned around one last time to look at the house she was leaving behind. Margaret was standing in the living room doorway watching them. The old woman's face was sad, but there was also something else in her expression, relief. David opened the front door and stepped outside with the suitcases. The cold night air rushed into the warm house. Your car keys are in your purse, David said. Drive safely. Sarah stepped outside onto the same porch where Margaret had been sitting in the cold just an hour ago. Now she understood how it felt to be pushed out into the night. But what Sarah didn't know was that this was just the beginning of the consequences she would face for her cruelty. Sarah put her suitcases in her car and got into the driver's seat. Her hands were shaking as she started the engine. She looked back at the house one more time and saw David closing the front door. The sound of the door closing felt like the end of everything she knew. As Sarah drove through the empty streets toward her parents' house, she started thinking about what she would tell them. Her parents lived in a big house on the other side of town. They had always been proud of Sarah's marriage to David, and they liked him very much. Sarah's mother, Mrs. Johnson, had always taught Sarah to be kind to older people. Respect your elders, she used to say when Sarah was young. One day you will be old too, and you'll want young people to treat you with kindness. Sarah parked outside her parents' house at 1:30 in the morning. All the lights were off, which meant her parents were sleeping. She sat in her car for a few minutes trying to think of what to say. Finally, Sarah got out of her car and rang the doorbell. She heard footsteps inside and then the porch light came on. Sarah? Her father's voice came through the door. Is that you? Yes, Daddy. It's me, Sarah called back. Mr. Johnson opened the door. He was wearing his pajamas and looked very worried. Sarah, what are you doing here? Is everything okay? Where's David? Sarah started crying again. Daddy, can I come in? I need a place to stay tonight. Mr. Johnson quickly opened the door wider and helped Sarah bring her suitcases inside. Of course, sweetheart. You can always stay here. But what happened? Why aren't you at home with David? By now, Sarah's mother had woken up too. She came downstairs in her robe, looking confused and worried. Sarah? What's wrong, honey? Mrs. Johnson asked, giving her daughter a hug. Sarah sat down on her parents' couch, the same couch where she used to sit when she was a little girl. But now she felt very different. She felt ashamed and scared. David and I had a fight, Sarah said quietly. A fight about what? Her father asked, sitting down next to her. Sarah looked at her parents' kind faces. These were the people who had raised her to be better than this. These were the people who had taught her right from wrong. And now she had to tell them how badly she had failed. It was about his mother, Sarah said, not looking at them. Margaret. Mrs. Johnson asked. What about her? Is she okay? Sarah took a deep breath. She knew she had to tell the truth, but she was scared of what her parents would think of her. I made her go outside tonight, Sarah said very quietly. Outside? Mr. Johnson asked, confused. Why would you make her go outside? It's freezing cold tonight. Sarah started crying harder. I told her she smelled bad and I made her sit outside until morning. David came home early and found her there. The living room became very quiet. Sarah's parents stared at her with shocked expressions on their faces. You did what? Mrs. Johnson asked, her voice getting higher. I was tired of living with her, Sarah said, trying to defend herself. She uses those smelly creams and she cooks food that makes the whole house smell weird. I had friends coming over and I didn't want them to smell those old person smells. Mr. Johnson stood up from the couch. His face was getting red with anger. Sarah Elizabeth Johnson, I cannot believe what I'm hearing. Sarah had not seen her father this angry since she was a teenager. That woman sacrificed everything for her son, Mr. Johnson continued. David told us how she worked multiple jobs and sold her land to pay for his education. And you made her sit outside in the cold like she was a dog. Sarah realized that her parents were not going to comfort her or take her side like she had hoped. I made a mistake, Sarah said weakly. But David overreacted. He kicked me out of my own house. Mrs. Johnson shook her head in disappointment. Sarah, that wasn't your house. That was David's family's house. And you had no right to treat his mother that way. Sarah looked at her parents with surprise. She had expected them to support her and help her get back together with David. Instead, they were taking David's side. But Sarah was about to learn that her parents' disappointment was nothing compared to what would happen to her reputation when word got out about what she had done. "Mom, Dad, please don't be so hard on me," Sarah begged. "I know I made a mistake, but I'm your daughter. You're supposed to support me." Mrs. Johnson sat down across from Sarah and looked at her with sad eyes. "Sarah, supporting you doesn't mean agreeing with you when you do something terrible. What you did to that poor woman was cruel and heartless. We raised you better than this," Mr. Johnson added. "Your mother and I are ashamed of your behavior." Sarah felt like her whole world was falling apart. First David had kicked her out, and now her own parents were disappointed in her. "What am I supposed to do now?" Sarah asked, wiping tears from her face. "You need to think about what you've done," Mrs. Johnson said firmly. "And you need to find a way to make it right." "But how can I make it right if David won't even talk to me?" Sarah asked. Mr. Johnson shook his head. "Sarah, this isn't about getting David back. This is about becoming a better person. You need to learn from this mistake." Sarah's parents showed her to her old bedroom upstairs. It looked exactly the same as when she was in high school, with pink walls and stuffed animals on the shelves. As Sarah lay in her childhood bed that night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Margaret sitting outside in the cold, shivering and alone. For the first time, Sarah tried to imagine how scared and hurt Margaret must have felt. Meanwhile, back at David's house, something very different was happening. David had made his mother a cup of hot tea and was sitting with her on the couch. Margaret was finally warm and safe, wrapped in a soft blanket. "Mom, I'm so sorry," David said, holding her hand. "I should have known what Sarah was doing. I should have protected you better." Margaret squeezed her son's hand gently. "David, you couldn't have known. Sarah was very good at hiding her true feelings when you were around." "But I should have seen the signs," David said sadly. "I should have noticed that you looked sad when I came home from work. I should have asked you more questions about how things were going." Margaret looked at her son's worried face. Even after everything that happened, she was more concerned about David's feelings than her own pain. "Son, don't blame yourself," Margaret said softly. "You married Sarah because you loved her. Love makes us want to see the best in people, even when they don't deserve it." David leaned back on the couch and sighed. "I can't believe I was married to someone who could be so cruel to you. How did I not see who she really was?" "Sometimes people can hide their true nature for a long time," Margaret explained. "Sarah was nice to me when you were dating because she wanted you to like her. But once she felt secure in your marriage, she showed her real personality." David nodded, understanding what his mother meant. "She fooled me completely. The important thing," Margaret said, "is that when you saw the truth, you did the right thing. You chose to protect me instead of protecting your marriage. That took courage." David looked at his mother with love and respect. "You're the most important person in my life, Mom. You always will be." As they sat together in the warm, peaceful house, both David and Margaret felt something they hadn't felt in a long time, complete safety and love. But the next morning would bring new challenges that neither of them expected. David woke up early and went to check on his mother. He found her sitting by the window in her room, looking out at the garden. The morning sun was shining on her face, making her look peaceful and calm. "Good morning, Mom," David said softly. "How did you sleep?" Margaret turned and smiled at her son. "Much better than last night, that's for sure," she said with a little laugh. David sat down next to her. "Mom, I've been thinking. I want to take you to see Dr. Martinez today for a checkup. Sitting in that cold air for so long might have affected your health." "Oh, David, I'm fine," Margaret said. "You don't need to worry so much." "Please, Mom. It would make me feel better to know for sure that you're okay," David insisted. Margaret could see the worry in her son's eyes, so she agreed. "All right, if it will help you feel better." At 9 o'clock in the morning, David called Dr. Martinez's office and explained what had happened. The nurse was shocked to hear that an elderly woman had been left outside in the cold all night. "Bring her in right away," the nurse said. "We'll see her as soon as you get here." As David and Margaret were getting ready to leave for the doctor's office, the doorbell rang. David opened the door to find Mrs. Peterson, their next-door neighbor, standing on the porch with a concerned look on her face. "David, dear, is everything all right?" Mrs. Peterson asked. "I saw some commotion here late last night and I was worried." Mrs. Peterson was a kind older woman who had lived next door for 15 years. She had always been friendly to David's family. "Come in, Mrs. Peterson," David said. "There's something I need to tell you." Mrs. Peterson came inside and saw Margaret sitting on the couch. She noticed that Margaret looked tired and a little pale. "Hello, Margaret," Mrs. Peterson said warmly. "How are you feeling today?" David sat down and told Mrs. Peterson the whole story, about finding his mother outside in the cold, about Sarah's cruel treatment, and about Sarah having to leave the house. Mrs. Peterson's face showed more and more shock as David talked. When he finished, she put her hand over her heart. "Oh my goodness," Mrs. Peterson gasped. "I can't believe Sarah would do such a thing. I saw Margaret sitting outside last night around 10 o'clock, but I thought maybe she was just enjoying the evening air." "You saw her outside?" David asked. "Yes, but it was dark and I didn't want to bother her if she wanted to be alone," Mrs. Peterson explained. "If I had known she was locked out, I would have come over immediately." Margaret reached over and patted Mrs. Peterson's hand. "You couldn't have known, dear. It's not your fault." Mrs. Peterson shook her head sadly. "That poor girl Sarah. Her parents must be so disappointed in her behavior." "Actually," David said, "Sarah went to her parents' house last night. From what I could tell, they weren't very happy with her either." Mrs. Peterson nodded. "I should think not. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson are good people. They taught Sarah better than this." Just then the phone rang. David answered it, and his face became serious as he listened. "That was my cousin Mark," David said after hanging up. "Somehow word is already getting around town about what happened last night." Margaret looked worried. "Oh no. I don't want this to become big gossip." "It's too late for that, Mom," David said gently. "Mark said he heard about it from his wife, who heard it from her sister, who works at the hospital." Mrs. Peterson looked confused. How would someone at the hospital know about this? David realized what must have happened. Sarah's friend Jenny works as a nurse at the hospital. Sarah probably called Jenny last night to complain about what happened. But Jenny must have told the story to other people. "Oh dear," Mrs. Peterson said. "You know how fast news travels in this town." Margaret sighed. "I just wanted this whole thing to be over and forgotten." But David could see that this was just the beginning. Soon, everyone in their small town would know what Sarah had done to his mother. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, share, and comment on the lessons you've learned. Let me know where you're watching from in the comment below. See you in my next video.